Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the silk curtains of feudal Japan, and what's hiding underneath is not the graceful cherry blossom romance you've seen in movies. You're about to find out how disgusting feudal Japan's sex life really was, to the point where you won't even believe it. So before you get cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing our community connect across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 1620, smack in the middle of Japan's Edo period. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the rituals, and they're about to involve you in ways you never asked for. Your bed is a thin futon laid across tatami mats that reek faintly of mildew. The paper walls of your house do nothing to block sound, which means you can hear every cough, sneeze and whisper from your neighbours. Privacy doesn't exist here. Your home is a box of wood and paper designed to share noise as much as space. And tonight, that lack of privacy is about to get very awkward. Because in feudal Japan, sex was rarely just about intimacy. It was about superstition, fertility, and a strict code of who was allowed to touch whom. You don't simply roll over and cuddle. No, you follow rules dictated by shrines, spirits, and social rank. The smell of incense wafts through the room, trying to cover the fact that you haven't bathed in a week, and neither has anyone else. Bathing wasn't forbidden, but it wasn't exactly daily. And when intimacy mixes with sweat, pickled fish, and tatami mould, it's less cherry blossom romance and more fermentation experiment. And here's the kicker. Women desperate for children sometimes slept with carved charms, small wooden or stone idols tucked under the futon, coated in herbs meant to coax a baby into being. Others placed amulets shaped like phalluses beneath their pillows. You're not cuddling with a lover tonight. You're spooning with a fertility charm that looks like it came from the world's most confusing souvenir shop. Meanwhile, samurai households treated intimacy like a battlefield report. Records were kept of attempts at conception, with retainers noting dates and results as if tracking rice harvests. Imagine trying to be romantic while someone in the next room is essentially updating a scoreboard. And then there's contraception, which is its own nightmare. Pepper and ginger mixtures were applied as a burning barrier against pregnancy. Other methods involved thin charms of folded paper, about as effective as using origami as a shield against a cannonball. The air in your little room grows heavy with incense and expectation. You can feel the absurd weight of rules pressing down. When to move, how to breathe, even who gets to see you without clothing. And just when you think it can't get stranger, someone suggests chewing raw garlic to sweeten your breath before meeting a lover. Congratulations, you now smell like an unwashed futon stuffed with sushi toppings. Welcome to the secret bedroom customs of feudal Japan, where spirits are watching, fertility charms are cuddling you back, and absolutely nothing is as simple as it should be. And if you think this is bizarre, just wait until you find out how religion made things even messier after dark. The air grows heavier as you move deeper into the world of feudal Japan, and tonight the focus shifts to something that makes fertility charms look tame. It is the realm of sacred rituals where intimacy and religion collided in ways that blur the line between devotion and discomfort. Shrines were not simply for prayer, they were also the stage for rites that bound sexuality to the supernatural, with a logic that seems almost incomprehensible to modern ears. Imagine standing barefoot on packed earth floors inside a Shinto shrine where the scent of cedar beams mixes with candle smoke and human sweat. The priest instructs women seeking children to present offerings, often in the form of carved phallic objects left at the altar. This was not symbolic in the abstract sense, it was literal, with entire shrines filled with oversized wooden and stone phalluses meant to draw the favour of fertility gods. These sacred shapes were believed to channel divine energy into the body. They were touched, prayed over, and sometimes even rubbed across the stomach of women desperate for pregnancy. It was religion through ritual objects, but it reads more like a bizarre hardware store aisle dedicated entirely to divine reproduction. The most famous example of this survives even today in festivals like Kanemaru Matsuri, sometimes called the Festival of the Steel Phallus, which traces its roots back to the Edo period. The legend tells of a demon that hid inside the womb of a young woman, biting off the genitals of two unfortunate men. To combat this supernatural menace, a blacksmith forged an iron phallus, which broke the demon's teeth and restored order. The ritual then morphed into a yearly celebration of fertility and sexual protection, with giant phallic floats paraded through town. In its time, however, this was not light-hearted fun. It was deadly serious. People believed their health, safety and lineage depended on appeasing the gods through these offerings. And this is where it becomes even stranger. In rural areas, phallic objects were not only placed at shrines, but also buried in rice paddies to ensure fertility of the crops. Intimacy and agriculture were linked under the same supernatural umbrella. The thinking was simple. If carved symbols could summon life in the womb, then they could summon life in the soil. Every stalk of rice was tied to the same divine system that governed childbirth, which means in essence that an entire nation was feeding itself on a cycle of sexual symbolism. It is one thing to pray for a good harvest. It is another to embed oversized stone phalluses in the mud and hope the gods are watching. The logic of these customs shows how blurred the line between the sacred and the sexual truly was. Shinto, with its emphasis on purity, paradoxically tolerated open expressions of fertility in ways that shocked European visitors. Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century were appalled when they saw shrines lined with carvings of exaggerated genitals. For them, religion was about suppression and modesty. In Japan, fertility and reproduction were openly acknowledged as divine forces to be honoured. This clash of cultural perspective created one of history's great misunderstandings. Europeans wrote horrified accounts describing the Japanese as indecent, while the Japanese themselves saw these rituals as simple piety. The humour comes in when you consider the daily lives of peasants who engaged in these practices. A farmer might spend the morning burying phallic charms in the field, and the evening praying at a shrine with his wife for more children, all while seeing no contradiction in the overlap. For him, planting rice and planting heirs were part of the same divine system. Modern agriculture may use fertilizer and irrigation, but in feudal Japan, you sometimes fertilized your crops with symbolic sex objects. It was both devotion and desperation, because famine and childlessness could mean the collapse of a family line. Now take a moment to picture the sensory world of these festivals. Crowds of villagers pressed together, chanting prayers, the smell of sweat and roasted fish filling the air, and in the centre of it all, enormous carved phalluses carried through the streets like relics. Children watched wide-eyed, elders bowed respectfully, and travellers looked on in confusion. These ceremonies were not hidden in private chambers. They were public, celebrated, and sanctioned by the community. There is no modern equivalent that captures both the solemnity and the absurdity. Imagine your local church hosting a fertility parade down Main Street, and you're only halfway to the reality. The consequences of these customs were profound. Women bore the pressure of being both religious devotees and vessels of lineage. If a child did not come, the fault often fell on them, regardless of their husband's health. Shrines became both spiritual sanctuaries and sites of personal shame, where repeated prayers might mark you as cursed. Men, on the other hand, sought virility through participation in these rituals, believing that alignment with the divine would restore strength or increase chances of heirs. In some cases, couples were even instructed to perform intimacy near shrine grounds as a symbolic act of devotion. It is one thing to pray quietly, it is another to involve your personal life in a public setting, under the eyes of neighbours and gods alike. There is a layer of absurdity in how earnestly these practices were followed. People had no medical knowledge of fertility cycles or reproductive science. What they had were rituals, symbols, and the conviction that the gods demanded participation. And while many modern listeners might shake their heads, it is worth remembering that faith provided the only framework for understanding why some families thrived and others withered. The logic may have been faulty, but but the fear was real. As the smell of incense lingers in your nose and the memory of chanting crowds rings in your ears, you begin to sense how overwhelming this system must have been. Every act of intimacy was not private pleasure, but a public performance tied to the divine and the agricultural. You could not escape the pressure of fertility because it hung in the air at festivals, in the soil of your fields, and in the eyes of your family. And this is only the beginning. Because as bizarre as the shrine rituals may sound, they pale in comparison to what unfolded within the rigid walls of the samurai household, where honour turned intimacy into a military affair of its own. Within the shadowed halls of the samurai estate, the expectations surrounding intimacy were as rigid as the lacquered armour stacked neatly in the corner. Here, nothing was free of the logic of duty and hierarchy. Even in the bedroom, honour and obligation reigned supreme. It was not simply about desire or pleasure. It was about proving lineage, maintaining social standing, and recording the results as carefully as one might log the spoils of battle. A samurai's life revolved around order. From how he tied his armour to how he bowed before his lord, every movement carried meaning. This obsession with ritual spilled directly into the household, where intimacy became yet another performance of loyalty and structure. A wife was often chosen not for love, but for the alliances she brought. Marriages among the warrior class were contracts, political arrangements that linked families, ensured loyalty, or increased wealth. The bedroom was not private, it was a continuation of strategy. The children produced were not just heirs, they were tools to reinforce ties. And if no children came, the consequences were heavy. Infertility was never approached with understanding. Instead, blame typically landed on the woman, regardless of reality. She might be subjected to fertility rituals, prayers at shrines, or even replaced entirely if the family line seemed threatened. For the husband, proving virility was equally tied to his honour. A man who could not father children risked whispers that he lacked the strength expected of his rank. This led to meticulous records kept within some samurai households, where intimacy was logged like battlefield manoeuvres. Imagine an attendant noting dates, conditions and outcomes, reducing one of the most private acts to a statistical report. And this is where the absurdity creeps in. While the West often mythologized knights as paragons of chastity, the reality of samurai culture was far more complex. It included not just arranged marriages, but also sanctioned extramarital relationships. In some cases, samurai men engaged in same-sex relationships with younger retainers, a practice documented in historical texts under the name wakashudo, or the way of youths. This was not seen as scandalous at the time, but as part of mentorship, blending martial training with intimacy. To modern ears, it raises questions of exploitation and power imbalance. To the samurai, it was framed as another structured bond of loyalty. The body itself was subject to constant scrutiny. Hygiene was inconsistent. Bathing was common in urban centres where public baths flourished, but it was not guaranteed in every season or region. Add to that the heavy diet of rice, pickled vegetables and fish, and the bedroom often smelled less of romance and more of fermented brine. Garlic and onions, sometimes chewed before encounters, only worsened the effect. For warriors accustomed to the stench of horse sweat and armour rust, this may have seemed ordinary. For anyone seeking tenderness, it was suffocating. Clothing also played its role in discomfort. Layered robes tied with stiff sashes made undressing a chore. The kimono, elegant as it was, required careful folding and untying. In some cases, men did not remove their garments entirely, preferring to lift and adjust rather than strip down. This was partly practicality and partly modesty. But in humid summers, the result was clinging fabric and sweat pooling beneath layers of cloth, hardly the romantic image that art scrolls might suggest. Another layer of strangeness came with expectations of loyalty. A wife of a samurai was bound not just by marriage, but by absolute duty. Her role was to maintain the household, produce heirs, and uphold her husband's honour. If she failed, her reputation could collapse, leaving her family shamed. In extreme cases, women might be pressured into religious vows or dismissed entirely. The man, however, faced no such restriction. He could pursue concubines or other arrangements without suffering the same stigma. It was a hierarchy that preserved power for men while confining women within rigid boundaries. Yet intimacy among the warrior class was not always solemn. Historical records describe gatherings where alcohol flowed freely, loosening the rigid rules of daily life. In these moments, behaviour could spiral into excess. Drunken encounters blurred the line between ritual and indulgence, but even then the consequences loomed. A man who drank too much and failed in his duty might face humiliation, as virility was directly tied to perceptions of strength. Imagine an entire household whispering about a warrior's inability to rise to the occasion, treating it with the same weight as a failed duel. The absurd part is how much documentation survives. Manuals from the Edo period detailed expectations for household conduct, blending Confucian ideals with native customs. Some even outlined appropriate behaviours for couples, suggesting that intimacy should follow a structured pattern of respect rather than spontaneous affection. It was intimacy stripped of warmth, transformed into a duty akin to polishing a sword or managing accounts. The psychological weight of the system must have been immense. A man carried his sword to prove his loyalty to his lord, and he carried his household to prove his loyalty to his lineage. The private was never truly private because reputation seeped into every corner of life. A wife's fertility was tied to her husband's honour, and his performance was tied to his perceived strength. Even the act of recording encounters turned what should have been human connection into a ledger entry. Picture it vividly. The dim light of oil lamps flickers across sliding screens. The smell of fermented rice wine hangs heavy in the air, and somewhere in the corner, an attendant quietly keeps notes. The couple is not alone. They are never alone. Even in the most intimate of acts, the weight of hierarchy, ritual, and surveillance presses in. There is no escape, only the suffocating reminder that everything in this world serves the system. And while this suffocating world of obligation defined samurai households, the strangeness of feudal Japan stretched even further, because outside the armoured estates and ritual-bound bedrooms lay another domain entirely, where pleasure itself became a commodity, and the floating world of courtesans and geisha shaped its own set of bizarre customs that still linger in history's memory. Beyond the rigid walls of samurai households, another universe thrived, one that operated on its own strange rules. It was known as the floating world, the realm of entertainment, courtesans, and geisha, where pleasure was commodified and ritualized to a degree that shocks the modern imagination. Here, intimacy was not spontaneous. It was staged, scripted, and layered with social and financial expectations that made the experience as much performance as it was reality. The pleasure quarters, most famously Yoshiwara in Edo, were entire districts sealed off from the rest of the city. Gates guarded the entrances, lanterns lit narrow streets, and the air buzzed with the hum of shamisen music and drunken laughter. Within these walls, courtesans became celebrities. Their faces appeared on woodblock prints, their names carried weight, and their costumes dazzled with silk and jewels. But behind the polished image lurked conditions that were anything but glamorous. Women were often sold into these establishments at young ages, bound by contracts that left them trapped for years, sometimes for life. The glittering facade of the floating world masked a system built on exploitation. The most famous of these courtesans were the oiran, high-ranking women who entertained not only through intimacy, but through conversation, poetry, and performance. To secure their company, clients paid staggering sums, sometimes enough to bankrupt themselves in the pursuit of status. It was not simply about attraction, it was about prestige. Being seen with a famous courtesan elevated a man's reputation, as if her refinement transferred to him by association. This twisted logic turned intimacy into a transaction of social capital. You were not paying for companionship, you were purchasing influence. wrapped in silk and powdered in white makeup. Yet the realities of the body could not be concealed by ceremony. Hygiene was a constant problem. Courtesans often shared cramped quarters, with little access to regular bathing. Perfumes, incense, and layers of clothing helped mask the smell of sweat, but the illusion only went so far. Heavy white face powder, popular in the Edo period, was made with lead, which slowly poisoned the skin, leaving sores and discoloration. A courtesan's painted beauty could literally be eating her alive beneath the makeup. Clients, meanwhile, arrived in various states of filth, carrying with them the odours of rice paddies, horse stables, or fish markets. The encounter was not the perfumed fantasy depicted in art, but a sensory overload of sweat, smoke, and decay. Diseases flourished in these districts. Syphilis, known in Japan as roga, spread rapidly, leaving devastating effects. Treatments were primitive at best, often involving mercury, which poisoned the body while doing little to cure the infection. Entire brothels could be crippled by outbreaks, yet business carried on. Men believed the status gained from visiting outweighed the risks, while the women had no choice but to continue working. The result was a cycle of illness and misery hidden beneath the surface of painted smiles and flowing robes. The rituals themselves added another layer of discomfort. And Oiran's appearance was a spectacle. Her hair was styled into elaborate shapes using wax and pins that sometimes weighed several pounds. Washing it was so difficult that the style might be kept intact for weeks, during which lice thrived. The layers of her kimono were equally burdensome, sometimes requiring attendants just to help her move. Intimacy under such conditions was not effortless. It was a logistical challenge, with fabric, pins, and makeup all forming barriers between the illusion of refinement and the reality of exhaustion. Geisha, often confused with courtesans, occupied a different role. They were primarily entertainers, trained in music, dance, and conversation. Their presence added elegance to gatherings, but their lives were no less bound by strict expectations. Though not all geisha engaged in intimacy, many were pressured into arrangements with wealthy patrons. Known as dana, these patrons provided financial support in exchange for exclusive companionship. The relationship was unequal by design. The geisha was both dependent on and trapped by the man's favour, her livelihood tied to his whims. The economics of the floating world shaped the very fabric of Japanese society. Men spent fortunes in pleasure quarters, draining family wealth for the sake of appearances. Some historians argue that this contributed to financial instability among samurai families, who already struggled with rigid stipends and rising costs. In a sense, intimacy itself became another form of warfare, bleeding households dry not with swords, but with silk and wine. The absurdity lies in how openly society tolerated and even celebrated these practices. Woodblock prints known as shunga depicted explicit scenes with astonishing detail, often blending humour with eroticism. These prints circulated widely, owned not only by clients but also by common townsfolk, who treated them as both entertainment and instruction. In a culture where intimacy was so heavily ritualized, shunga became a strange form of education, offering glimpses into acts that were both taboo and normalized. The very same society that filled shrines with fertility symbols also bought illustrated manuals on the mechanics of intimacy, sometimes accompanied by poetry that turned the grotesque into something almost comical. Picture the sensory world again. Lantern light flickers off lacquered wood. The smell of sake mingles with smoke and sweat. Laughter echoes from one corner while coughing fills another. A courtesan, her face painted white and her lips dyed red, glides through the crowd with the weight of her hairstyle pulling at her scalp. Men watch in awe, not realizing that beneath the powder, sores fester from lead poisoning, and beneath the silk, exhaustion gnaws at her bones. The illusion of elegance rests on a foundation of discomfort. The floating world presented itself as a paradise, yet it was a paradise built on rules, rituals, and rot. It reveals the contradiction at the heart of feudal Japan's sexual culture, where intimacy was elevated to art but reduced to transaction, where beauty was painted on while disease spread beneath, and where prestige mattered more than health or happiness. As the lanterns dim and the noise of the quarter fades in your ears, another world looms at the edges of your imagination. Beyond the courtesans and geisha lay practices even stranger, where myths of contraception and bizarre attempts at control shaped the lives of countless women. And that strange story of pepper, paper, and desperate improvisation awaits you next. The streets of Edo may have glimmered with lantern light and the allure of courtesans, but beneath the painted smiles and layers of silk lurked a very different struggle. Intimacy was never just about attraction. It was about survival, and survival meant preventing children when a family could not afford another mouth to feed, or avoiding shame when relationships crossed the boundaries of rank. In a society without modern medicine, contraception was a patchwork of myth, ritual, and sheer bodily punishment. Some of the most common methods were herbal. Women chewed or inserted mixtures of ginger, pepper, and garlic, trusting that the heat of these plants would repel conception. To put it plainly, these remedies worked less like barriers and more like self-inflicted chemical burns. Records suggest women would insert pepper paste directly, causing pain and inflammation under the belief that such irritation would stop pregnancy. The logic was tragically simple. If it hurt, it must be working. In reality, all it guaranteed was agony and possibly infection. Others turned to charms. Thin slips of folded paper inscribed with prayers were placed as protective barriers. These were known as harigami, a blend of spiritual hope and impractical design. Paper, of course, was never meant for such use, and the results range from ineffective to outright harmful. Some women tied these charms to their undergarments, or carried them in pouches close to the body, trusting that divine power could ward off unwanted conception. In a society where religion infused every act, these talismans carried weight, even if their protection was nothing more than symbolic. The wealthier classes sometimes relied on imported ideas. Chinese medical texts filtered through centuries of translation suggested odd concoctions meant to regulate fertility. Some involved drinking teas laced with mercury or other minerals, which slowly poisoned the body. Others relied on timing, urging women to avoid intimacy on certain days of the lunar cycle. While this carried a shred of biological logic, it was applied with such rigid superstition that it rarely worked. What it did accomplish was layering fear over every act, turning intimacy into a calendar-driven ritual of anxiety. Hygiene too played its role in shaping these practices. The public bathhouse was a central feature of Japanese towns, yet even here, beliefs about cleanliness mixed uneasily with sexual customs. Men often flocked to bathhouses not just to wash but to socialize, and in some cases to pursue encounters. While the water may have soothed tired muscles, it also served as a petri dish of germs. Soap, as understood today, did not exist. Instead, people scrubbed with sand or cloth, removing surface dirt but not eliminating bacteria. Bathing was frequent, but true sterilization was out of reach. In the floating world, courtesans developed their own hygiene rituals. Some rinsed with herbal infusions believed to cleanse the body, though these often disrupted natural health and caused further irritation. Sek was sometimes used as a wash, poured directly in the belief that its alcohol content could purify. While this might have provided a brief sting of cleanliness, it was no medical solution. Combined with the lead-based makeup, poor diet, and endless exhaustion, the result was a constant cycle of illness hidden beneath the facade of refinement. Diseases spread with frightening speed. Syphilis became so widespread in the 16th century that it reshaped entire practices in the pleasure quarters. Symptoms such as sores, rashes, and hair loss were barely concealed beneath layers of clothing and makeup. Treatments involved mercury ointments, which did more damage than good, slowly poisoning the user while leaving the infection unchecked. The irony was bitter. In trying to cure disease, patients often accelerated their own decline. Even outside the courts and quarters, contraceptive attempts grew increasingly desperate. Some believed in withdrawal, others in herbal tonics consumed after intimacy, and still others trusted in ritual abstinence on unlucky days. The idea of lunar influence was particularly strong, with calendars marking auspicious and inauspicious nights for fertility. Couples structured their encounters around these cycles, convinced that the moon dictated the womb. While this added rhythm to their lives, it offered little in terms of actual control. The sensory experience of these attempts must have been overwhelming. Imagine the sting of pepper paste burning the skin, the bitter taste of herbal teas brewed in desperation, or the faint scratch of paper charms pressed against the body. These were not acts of pleasure, they were acts of fear, clumsy improvisations made under the weight of necessity. The body became both battlefield and laboratory, subjected to experiments that blended faith, myth, and pain. At the heart of this lies the absurd contradiction of feudal Japan, a culture that celebrated fertility through shrines and festivals simultaneously sought to control it through superstition and discomfort. On one hand, giant phalluses were paraded through streets in the name of abundance. On the other, women burned themselves with ginger paste to avoid another child. The same society that honoured the divine gift of life also created practices that left countless bodies scarred and sickened. The impact extended beyond the body. Women bore the brunt of these rituals, their health sacrificed to preserve family stability. Men participated, but it was the women who endured the physical consequences. In many cases, they faced blame if methods failed, as if they alone were responsible for the whims of fertility. The imbalance of responsibility left scars not only on the body, but on the social fabric, reinforcing hierarchies that already confined women's roles. Picture again the narrow streets of Edo, lanterns glowing in the night, laughter spilling from taverns, and behind paper doors, a woman grimacing as she applies another paste of pepper and herbs, hoping desperately it will work this time. It is an image far from the elegance of ukiyo-e prints. It is the lived reality of a society where myth-dictated medicine and intimacy was fraught with discomfort. And as those narrow streets close in, the story twists further, because there was another form of sexual practice that spread just as widely, one that carried its own blend of ritual, exploitation, and danger. It was the strange world of wakashudo, the way of youths, where samurai mentorship blurred into intimacy, and the weight of loyalty shaped the most private of bonds. Within the layered codes of samurai life, another custom emerged that blurred the line between mentorship and intimacy. It was known as wakashudo, the way of youths, and it reveals yet another dimension of how sexuality in feudal Japan was shaped not only by desire but by duty, hierarchy, and ritual. To the samurai, this practice was framed as noble, almost an extension of the same loyalty that bound them to their lord. To a modern ear, it lands very differently. The arrangement usually involved an older samurai and a younger male page, often in his teens. The relationship was meant to serve as both instruction and bond, a merging of martial training with physical companionship. The senior figure was expected to act as a mentor, providing guidance not only in swordsmanship and discipline, but also in loyalty and conduct. In return, the youth offered admiration, obedience, and often his body. It was a system justified as moral education, but it was also steeped in imbalance. The older samurai held all the power. Historical texts describe this practice with surprising frankness. Manuals on samurai conduct included references to these bonds, treating them as natural extensions of martial culture. Loyalty was the central justification. A youth who gave himself to his mentor demonstrated ultimate devotion, and the mentor who accepted him reinforced that tie. The intimacy was not necessarily hidden, and in some contexts it was even celebrated. Samurai tales and poetry sometimes reference such relationships, portraying them as honourable rather than shameful. Yet beneath the rhetoric of loyalty lay an uncomfortable reality. These arrangements were often less about choice and more about expectation. A youth might feel pressured to submit as part of his training, unable to refuse without risking dishonour. In effect, the system blurred consent. What was presented as noble mentorship could easily become exploitation. And because honour dictated silence, few would have dared to question the arrangement. The sensory environment of such mentorships tells its own story. Imagine the training grounds, the smell of sweat from hours of practice, the clatter of bamboo swords, and then the shift as the same relationship carried into the private quarters. The same hands that corrected a stance on the battlefield now reach for something entirely different. For the youth, the role was unavoidable. For the mentor, it was another privilege of rank. Religious and philosophical influences added layers to the justification. Buddhism, which had long traditions of monastic intimacy between teachers and novices in other parts of Asia, created a precedent that echoed into Japanese practice. Confucian ideals of hierarchy and obedience also reinforced the notion that the younger should submit to the older. Combined with the samurai's obsession with loyalty, these influences produced a system where wakashudo could flourish openly without collapsing under stigma. Not all aspects were physical. Some relationships emphasized emotional closeness, poetry exchanged in secret, or gestures of affection framed as loyalty. But physical intimacy was common enough that it shaped cultural memory. Scrolls and literature from the Edo period include references to these bonds, sometimes romanticizing them, sometimes treating them with humour. Shunga prints even depicted scenes of older samurai with younger partners, normalizing the practice for audiences who consumed these works as entertainment. The contradictions are striking. In a culture that placed such importance on lineage and fertility, entire sections of samurai life embraced practices that did nothing to produce heirs, yet they were accepted because they were woven into the fabric of martial culture. It was a reminder that sexuality was not purely biological, but also social, shaped by expectations, roles, and power structures. A samurai might maintain a wife for heirs while keeping a youth for companionship, seeing no conflict in the dual arrangement. Diseases, of course, spread in these circles as they did in the pleasure quarters. The same lack of effective medicine meant that infections carried through mentorship bonds as easily as through brothels. Mercury ointments reappeared as the go-to treatment, poisoning those who used them. The younger partners often bore the brunt of this, their health sacrificed under the weight of loyalty. The imbalance of power meant they had little recourse. The absurdity emerges when you imagine the juxtaposition. By day, a samurai drilled in the art of discipline, practicing precise strikes and reciting codes of loyalty. By night, those same codes justified arrangements that would raise eyebrows even in his own time if taken out of context. The same warrior who might execute someone for dishonour could publicly praise the devotion of his youth companion. It reveals the elasticity of honour stretched to cover contradictions that were never acknowledged as contradictions at all. These practices were not limited to elite households. Even lower-ranked warriors adopted versions of wakashudo, framing them as bonds of loyalty within their smaller circles. Manuals from the era speak of these arrangements as if they were simply another part of training. They were discussed alongside sword drills and etiquette, normalised through repetition. This institutional acceptance meant the practice was far more widespread than isolated scandal. It was systemic, embedded in the logic of the warrior class. Picture again the estate. Oil lamps flicker against painted screens, the smell of lacquer and steel fills the air, and within this setting mentorship takes on its intimate form. Outside, attendants shuffle silently, aware of the arrangement but trained not to acknowledge it. Within, the youth plays his role, instructed not just in combat but in devotion, his very body treated as part of the curriculum. For the mentor, it is affirmation of status. For the youth, it is a rite of passage he never chose. The lasting impact of wakashudo reveals much about feudal Japan's sexual culture. It shows how power shaped intimacy, how hierarchy could transform personal acts into institutional expectations, and how rituals masked exploitation beneath a language of loyalty. It was not hidden or marginalized, but accepted as a reflection of the times. To step into this world is to confront a reality where duty and desire merged into one of history's most unsettling traditions. And as that unsettling picture settles in, the world beyond the samurai estate calls again. Because while the warrior class created its own bonds, the common folk pursued rituals just as bizarre, mixing superstition and survival in ways that left their own strange mark on Japanese sexual history. The story moves from armoured halls to village festivals, where fertility and intimacy merged in public displays that were equal parts devotion and discomfort. Far from the polished estates of samurai and the lantern glow of Eido's pleasure quarters, the villages of feudal Japan had their own way of blending sexuality with ritual. Life in the countryside was brutal, and survival hinged on the fertility of both people and crops. In a world where famine or childlessness could spell disaster, villagers poured their hopes into festivals that merged worship, superstition, and intimacy in ways that can leave the modern imagination squirming. One of the most striking features of these festivals was their openness. Fertility was not hidden behind sliding screens or whispered prayers. It was paraded through streets, chanted in songs, and carved into objects carried with pride. Wooden phalluses, sometimes towering several feet high, were borne through villages on the shoulders of men, cheered by onlookers who believed these objects would secure both agricultural abundance and human offspring. Entire shrines dedicated to these symbols still exist today, evidence of how deeply embedded this practice was in everyday life. In some communities, couples were expected to participate in symbolic acts during festivals, reenacting myths of creation or demonstrating fertility for the sake of the harvest. These were not acts of privacy. They were acts of public devotion. While the more explicit elements have faded with time, historical accounts and folk traditions hint at practices that blurred the line between performance and intimacy. Imagine standing in the crowd as chants rise, smoke from burning offerings thickens in the air, and neighbours applaud a ritual that would never pass modern standards of propriety. The connection between fertility and agriculture was constant. Rice was the lifeblood of the village, and its growth was seen as parallel to human reproduction. Just as the seed needed fertile soil, the womb needed divine blessing. Rituals often involved symbolic planting ceremonies, where phallic objects were buried in the earth, or carried around fields to encourage a bountiful harvest. The absurdity is striking. In the absence of irrigation science, villagers relied on wooden symbols to convince the gods to send rain and growth. It was devotion expressed through awkward props. One infamous ritual involved villagers eating foods considered to embody sexual energy. Leeks, garlic, and certain fish were believed to boost fertility. Banquets during festivals became feasts of symbolic indulgence, where entire communities consumed these foods in the belief that the energy would pass to their bodies. The sensory result was predictable. Imagine a crowded hall filled with the stench of garlic breath, sweat, and unwashed clothing, all while participants cheered and laughed in the name of fertility. The atmosphere was less divine and more suffocating, yet it was endured year after year. Clothing, too, carried symbolic weight. During some fertility festivals, participants wore costumes exaggerating sexual features. Men paraded with oversized phallic props strapped to their bodies, while women carried dolls or effigies symbolizing the womb. These costumes, though comedic to modern eyes, were taken seriously as invocations of abundance. To the villagers, they were not jokes, they were prayers. To imagine this is to picture an entire town engaged in something between a carnival and a parody, yet undertaken with utter sincerity. The absurdity deepens when considering how young people were sometimes drawn into these customs. In some regions, festivals served as opportunities for matchmaking, with intimacy encouraged under the guise of ritual. Young men and women might be pushed together during celebrations, their unions seen as blessings for the community. The lack of privacy, the heavy hand of superstition, and the pressure of expectation turned what might have been tender moments into acts of obligation. A festival that looked festive on the surface carried a weight of social enforcement beneath it. Historical sources describe how these rituals sometimes bordered on the shocking. In certain accounts, villagers engaged in group dances where movement symbolized sexual acts. Songs with explicit lyrics were sung openly, accompanied by drums and flutes, with no shame in their bawdiness. The community celebrated together, stripping away privacy in favour of collective affirmation. What might scandalise a modern listener was treated as normal, even necessary. It was a reminder that sexuality was not seen purely as personal, but as communal, tied to the fate of the entire village. Hygiene was, of course, another layer of discomfort. Festivals often took place in warm months, when sweat clung to bodies and bathing opportunities were scarce. The crush of people pressed together, chanting and dancing, produced an overwhelming mixture of odours. Add to this the smoke of burning offerings, the stench of sake spilled in the dirt, and the lingering smell of fish consumed at feasts, and the sensory world becomes nearly unbearable. What was meant as divine invocation often resembled a crowded barn filled with human bodies in various states of decay. Despite their strangeness, these rituals reveal the desperate ingenuity of villagers. Without science, they turn to symbolism. Without medicine, they turn to myth. Every act was directed toward survival, even if it meant enduring humiliation or discomfort. The body became a tool of worship, and intimacy became a language for communicating with the gods. The irony is clear. A culture that valued modesty in daily life openly abandoned it during these festivals, creating spectacles that would leave modern audiences stunned. Picture yourself among them. The ground is sticky with spilled sake, your ears ring from chanting drums, and before you passes a giant wooden phallus carried like a sacred relic. Children laugh, elders bow, and you are pressed shoulder to shoulder with neighbours as incense burns in your lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a couple participates in a ritual act meant to secure fertility for all. There is no privacy, no shame, only the collective demand that everyone play their part in the survival of the community. The festivals reveal the contradictions at the heart of feudal Japan's sexual practices. They were both solemn and ridiculous, sacred and grotesque. They elevated fertility to divine importance, yet reduced individuals to props in communal rituals. The absurdity lies not in the devotion itself, but in the extremes it reached, transforming villages into theatres of fertility where everyone was both actor and audience. And as the festival drums fade from your ears, the story twists yet again, because another realm of sexual practice lay hidden within the temples and monasteries, where monks who preached purity often lived in ways that contradicted their vows. Behind the silence of cloisters, the most unsettling rituals of all were carried out, shielded by walls that claimed to house the sacred. The hush of temple bells might suggest peace, but inside the cloisters of feudal Japan's monasteries, silence often hid scandal. Monks were bound by vows of chastity and purity, yet history records reveal that these same men indulged in practices that turned temples into centres of whispered rumours. In a society where religion was woven into daily life, the gap between the sacred image and the lived reality created some of the strangest contradictions in Japanese history. Temples were powerful institutions owning land, collecting donations, and wielding influence over lords and peasants alike. With that power came privilege, and with privilege came abuse. Monks, freed from the obligations of marriage, were nonetheless human. The expectation of celibacy clashed with desire, and the result was a shadow world of practices carried out behind temple walls. Some monasteries became notorious for harbouring intimate relationships with both women and younger male novices. It was so common that the phrase Chigo Monogatari, or tales of temple acolytes, became a literary genre in its own right, romanticizing the bonds between monks and their youthful attendants. These Chigo, often boys from noble families sent to temples for education, lived under the care of senior monks. In theory, the arrangement was meant to provide spiritual training and discipline. In practice, it often blurred into intimacy. The boys were dressed in elaborate robes, their faces powdered and painted in ways that echoed courtesan aesthetics, and poetry described their beauty in language normally reserved for women. This was no secret. It was celebrated in art and literature, treated as an extension of Buddhist devotion, though to modern readers it looks far more like institutional exploitation. The contradictions grew sharper when temples themselves sponsored festivals with overtly sexual symbolism. Phallic carvings were not just found in village shrines, but also in Buddhist contexts, where they were tied to fertility and abundance. The blending of Shinto fertility worship with Buddhist ritual produced bizarre results. On one hand, monks preached restraint. On the other, they oversaw ceremonies where sacred statues bore unmistakably exaggerated anatomy. The sacred and the profane coexisted, and nobody seemed eager to resolve the tension. Women, too, became entangled in temple life. Although Buddhist teachings often discouraged intimacy, monks were notorious for maintaining relationships with women in nearby towns. Records survive of scandals where temple leaders fathered children despite their vows. Some even kept unofficial concubines within temple grounds, hidden under layers of ritual justification. The hypocrisy was widely known, yet tolerated, because temples wielded immense power. For the surrounding community, pointing out a monk's misconduct was less likely to spark reform, and more likely to invite trouble. Diseases did not spare the cloisters. Just as syphilis ravaged the floating world, it also infiltrated temples. Without medical understanding, monks often turned to herbal remedies or superstitious cures, none of which offered protection. Mercury treatments once again appeared, poisoning those who sought relief. The irony of a temple devoted to healing chants and sacred sutras harbouring sick, suffering monks who poison themselves in secret adds another layer of dark absurdity. The sensory world of a monastery reveals even more. Imagine long wooden halls polished by bare feet, the smell of incense clinging to robes, and behind the silence of chanting whispers of forbidden acts. Novices carrying water jars might pause at a doorway, catching glimpses of relationships that were never supposed to exist. The same bells that summoned monks to meditation also rang over a world where purity was constantly compromised. Philosophical justifications were stretched to breaking. Some monks framed their relationships with boys as paths to enlightenment, claiming that devotion and intimacy could lead to spiritual awakening. Poetry celebrated these bonds, cloaking desire in metaphors of moonlight and blossoms. What should have been denounced was instead idealized, preserved in illustrated scrolls and manuscripts that survive to this day. These documents reveal how normalized the practice had become, blurring the line between doctrine and indulgence. The hierarchy of the temple compounded the problem. Senior monks held absolute authority over novices, making refusal nearly impossible. Obedience was drilled into the structure of temple life, leaving little room for resistance. For the younger boys, the system was less about choice and more about survival within a powerful institution. What was painted as spiritual guidance often reduced them to pawns in the desires of their superiors. The broader society was not blind to these contradictions. Satirical stories circulated, poking fun at the hypocrisy of monks who preached purity while indulging in forbidden pleasures. Some woodblock prints even depicted monks in compromising positions, a form of social commentary that revealed how common the scandals were. Humour became a coping mechanism, allowing people to acknowledge corruption without directly challenging the authority of the temples. The absurdity is stark. Imagine kneeling before a golden Buddha, incense smoke curling around you, while knowing that behind the curtain, the very men leading chants are entangled in acts that defy their vows. The same hand that offers you a blessing might belong to someone whose private life tells a very different story. The duality was baked into the system, a performance of holiness that masked deeply human indulgences. These contradictions remind us that sexuality in feudal Japan was never simple. It permeated every layer of society, from peasants burying wooden symbols in rice paddies to monks composing love poetry to their acolytes. The difference was only in how it was framed. In villages it was survival, in pleasure quarters it was commerce, in temples it was cloaked in the language of devotion. But the underlying reality was the same. Desire refused to be contained by rules, rituals, or vows. Picture once more the temple at night. Lanterns flicker against carved beams, the drone of chanting lingers in the air, and within the walls, intimacy continues in defiance of doctrine. The smell of incense cannot mask the reality. Purity is preached in public while indulgence thrives in private. It is a reminder that the human body does not bend easily to commandments, no matter how sacred. And as the image of cloistered scandals lingers, the story presses outward again, toward another realm where sexuality shaped daily life in unsettling ways. This time it is not about temples or villages, but about the hidden world of childbirth rituals, where beliefs about purity and pollution turned one of life's most natural acts into a site of fear, taboo, and shocking practices. The temple bells fade, and in their place rises the sound of something far more primal. A woman's cry, sharp and guttural, fills the narrow wooden house. Childbirth in feudal Japan was not a private matter hidden away in sterile rooms. It was a ritualized ordeal, burdened with superstition, fear, and practices that turned one of a life's most natural acts into something deeply unsettling. At the heart of these customs was the belief in kagare, the concept of pollution. Blood and birth were seen as impure forces that stained both the body and the space in which they occurred. This made childbirth a paradox. The arrival of new life was celebrated, yet the process itself was treated as dangerously defiling. Mothers were often isolated, forced into separate huts or designated rooms, where they endured labour alone or with the help of attendants who themselves risked being polluted. Imagine being shoved into a straw hut on the edge of a village to give birth, with everyone treating you as if you carried a contagious curse. That was the reality for countless women. Midwives played central roles, but their work was laced with ritual. They were not only birth attendants, but also guardians against spirits believed to prey on women in labour. Protective charms were hung in rooms, ropes tied with paper strips were stretched across doorways, and prayers were recited to ward off supernatural interference. Some midwives smeared protective herbs or ash on the mother's body, believing these substances repelled demons. The sensory effect was grim. The smell of sweat and blood mixed with smoke from burning talismans and the acrid bite of herbs, creating an atmosphere more like an exorcism than a birth. The mother herself was expected to endure pain as part of her duty. Screaming was not always tolerated, as it was thought to invite spirits or show weakness. Some records suggest women bit down on sticks or cloth to suppress their cries, while others were instructed to chant prayers during contractions, turning agony into forced devotion. If she failed, blame might follow, as though her suffering had cursed the child or displeased the gods. It was not enough to survive childbirth. She had to survive it with stoic grace, in the middle of a ritual designed to remind her of her impurity. Tools were primitive. Cutting the umbilical cord was done with knives that were often reused without proper cleaning. Infection was a constant risk, and many women died within days of giving birth. In some regions, cords were tied with strips of straw or plant fibres, leaving wounds exposed to bacteria. The irony is painful. The rituals were meant to protect, yet the very tools they used spread disease. Modern medicine was centuries away, and all they had were herbs, chants, and crude implements. The treatment of the newborn was equally unsettling. Babies were rubbed with salt, not only as a disinfectant, but as a purification ritual to remove the pollution of birth. Salt was also scattered around the birthing room, sprinkled on doorways and even applied to attendants. The house might smell like a fish market by the time the ordeal ended, a heavy, clinging brine that masked nothing of the blood and sweat. The infant's first experience of the world was not tenderness, but the sting of ritual salt and the drone of chants. Mothers were considered polluted long after the birth. They often remained in seclusion for weeks, barred from shrines and temples. In some areas, they were restricted from handling food or engaging in daily tasks until purification ceremonies were performed. Imagine giving birth and then being treated as if your touch spoiled rice, water, and even your own family's well-being. Isolation compounded exhaustion. A woman might be surrounded by attendants during labour, only to find herself shunned in the days that followed. Men, meanwhile, often stayed away entirely. Husbands were rarely present, as their presence was thought to invite impurity or anger spirits. The woman endured her ordeal surrounded only by midwives and female relatives, while her husband carried on as if untouched by the event. The disconnect was immense. For men, childbirth was something abstract, associated with impurity and inconvenience. For women, it was a matter of survival in a hostile ritual landscape. Some practices bordered on the absurd. In certain regions, ropes tied with paper talismans were believed to protect both mother and child, but if the rope broke during labour, it was taken as an omen of death. Women endured not only physical pain, but also the constant weight of superstition, where every snap of a thread or flicker of a candle was read as a sign. Even the placement of the birthing mat mattered. Facing the wrong direction risked angering spirits, and some women were forced to shift mid-labour to realign themselves with the dictates of ritual. Mortality rates were devastating. Records suggest that maternal death was tragically common, with infections, blood loss, and exhaustion taking countless lives. Yet rather than question the rituals, communities often doubled down on them, believing failure to perform the rites correctly had caused the tragedy. The cycle reinforced itself. More superstition, more ritual, more suffering. Picture the scene in full. A woman lies on a straw mat, her body racked with pain, her face slick with sweat. Around her, midwives chant prayers, wave smouldering herbs, and tie charms to the walls. The air stinks of smoke, salt, and blood. No husband comes to comfort her. When the child finally arrives, it is greeted not with gentle hands, but with salt and ritual purification. The mother, exhausted and bleeding, is declared polluted and confined to weeks of seclusion. The cycle of life begins with fear and stigma, all framed as devotion. What emerges from this picture is another contradiction of feudal Japan. The same society that celebrated fertility with festivals and paraded phallic symbols through the streets treated the act of giving birth as dangerously contaminating. Women were revered as mothers, yet shunned as polluted. Childbirth was sacred in its outcome but profane in its process. It reveals how sexuality, reproduction, and ritual were entangled in ways that left women burdened, isolated, and often broken. And as the cries of labour fade into silence, another story stirs, one that pulls us away from birth and into death, where the treatment of bodies and beliefs about the afterlife produced their own disturbing sexual customs, linking desire and the supernatural in unsettling ways. The cries of childbirth fade into silence, but silence never lasted long in feudal Japan. For every new life came the certainty of death, and with death came rituals that were as unsettling as the birth that preceded them. In a world where spirits lingered among the living, intimacy did not always end with the grave. Folklore and ritual blurred the line between desire and death, giving rise to customs that look grotesque through modern eyes. At the heart of these beliefs was the conviction that spirits remained close to their bodies. Funerals were not just ceremonies of farewell, they were negotiations with restless ghosts who might be angered by neglect. And when it came to sexuality, those ghosts were feared not only as omens but as potential participants. Stories abounded of women who died before marriage returning as spirits to seduce the living, determined to experience the intimacy denied to them in life. These were known as ubumi, ghost mothers or brides, whose pale forms haunted villages, whispering desires in the night. The thought of a ghost demanding affection may sound absurd, but for villagers who believed it, precautions were necessary. Funeral rituals reflected these anxieties. Corpses were washed and prepared, but their genitals were often covered or bound with cloth to prevent spirits from using them. Some texts even mention the tying of cords around the body, a symbolic restraint to keep desire from spilling into the world of the living. The absurd image of attendants nervously wrapping a corpse in rope while chanting sutras shows how seriously these fears were taken. To the mourners, it was not superstition. It was protection against a fate where ghosts mingled lust with vengeance. The treatment of women's bodies was especially marked by taboo. Unmarried women who died young were sometimes given makeshift marriages and death, paired symbolically with male effigies, or buried with ritual dolls to satisfy their supposed longing. The idea was that without symbolic consummation, their spirits would wander the earth, seeking partners among the living. Imagine being so terrified of ghostly seduction that you stage a wedding in the graveyard, complete with paper dolls and whispered vows. This was not comedy to them, it was survival. Male corpses too were treated with caution. There are records of monks warning against leaving bodies unattended, lest spirits exploit the opening to re-enter through the most vulnerable orifices. Protective charms were placed near the groin and mouth, a strangely specific defense that reveals the obsessive anxiety surrounding the body even after death. Death did not strip away sexuality, it magnified it, turning every corpse into a potential vessel of supernatural mischief. Folklore magnified these fears with grotesque tales. Yurei, or wandering spirits, often appeared in stories of seduction gone wrong. A woman abandoned by her lover might return in death to torment him with nightly visits, demanding his body until he withered away. Some tales describe men being drained by ghostly partners, their lives sapped in a grotesque parody of intimacy. It was both cautionary tale and whispered nightmare, a reminder that sexuality could follow you into the grave. The sensory atmosphere of funerals reflected this unease. The smell of incense burned constantly to purify the air, but it mixed with the stench of decay that no amount of smoke could mask. Attendants chanted sutras, their voices rising and falling in monotone rhythm, while relatives sprinkled salt over the body to ward off impurity. In the corner, talismans were tied to walls and doors, transforming the house into a barricade against spirits. Yet beneath the chants and charms lay a deep fear that desire could not be contained by rituals alone. Monks themselves did little to ease these tensions. Some embraced the folklore, composing tales that blurred morality with eroticism. Illustrated scrolls depicted spirits in compromising scenes, using humour and shock to both entertain and instruct. These works, often consumed alongside shunga, made the grotesque into a form of macabre entertainment. Imagine sitting in a dim room, leafing through woodblock prints of skeletons engaged in acts with the living, laughing nervously while pretending not to believe. It was education through absurdity, a cultural reminder that desire, death, and pollution were all linked. The contradictions multiplied when considering how purity was enforced. Mourners avoided intimacy after funerals, convinced that the pollution of death made such acts dangerous. Yet the very same rituals eroticized death through tales and images, keeping sexuality bound tightly to the grave. It was a society that insisted on restraint while constantly feeding imagination with grotesque possibilities. The tension must have been suffocating, as if every act of mourning carried a whisper of scandal. The absurdity peaks when you picture the village at night. A fresh burial mound glistens with offerings of rice and sake, incense curls into the air, and somewhere in the distance a man avoids walking past the grave for fear of being seduced by the spirit of a woman who never married. The line between devotion and paranoia blurs completely. What should have been solemn remembrance became a theatre of sexual anxiety, with the dead themselves cast as unwilling actors. These customs remind us how deeply sexuality permeated even the spaces meant to transcend it. Temples, shrines, villages, and graves all carried the weight of taboo, ritual, and desire. Death was not the end of sexuality in feudal Japan. It was its grotesque continuation, written into rituals, whispered in folklore, and carved into the collective imagination. And as the smoke of incense drifts away from the graveyard, another world waits to be uncovered, one that pushes the absurdity further still. Beyond the fear of spirits and the pollution of birth or death lay the world of bizarre medical treatments, where the pursuit of health and virility led to remedies so grotesque they make ghost weddings look almost sensible. The graveyard smoke drifts away, but the obsession with the body never rests. In feudal Japan, medicine was not only about healing illness, it was about controlling fertility, restoring virility, and purging impurity. And in a world without modern science, remedies often tipped into the grotesque. Doctors, monks, and healers prescribed treatments that sound more like punishments than cures, especially when it came to sexuality. Herbal medicine dominated the landscape. Based on Chinese traditions filtered through centuries of Japanese adaptation, it relied on plants believed to carry elemental energies. Ginseng, for example, was touted as a stimulant of virility. Ground into powder or boiled into tea, it was consumed by men desperate to extend stamina or recover lost strength. But the supply was scarce and expensive. What peasants ended up with were substitutes, often bitter roots that did nothing but upset the stomach. Imagine downing a bowl of boiling weeds in the hope that it might save your reputation in bed. The only thing it reliably produced was nausea. More alarming were the mineral-based treatments. Mercury, already infamous in Europe, found its way into Japanese remedies too. Mixed into ointments or consumed in small amounts, it was believed to purge infection, restore energy, and combat sexually transmitted diseases. In reality, it poisoned the body slowly, leaving tremors, madness, and early death in its wake. Yet desperate patients clung to it, convinced that the burning sensation meant it was working. The irony is brutal. In trying to cure the shame of syphilis, men and women often destroy themselves from within. Animal products also crept into these remedies. Powdered deer antler was ground and swallowed as a tonic for virility. Tiger bones, imported at staggering prices, were treated as aphrodisiacs. Even dried seahorses appeared in prescriptions believed to stoke desire. The sheer impracticality is absurd. Families bankrupted themselves buying exotic powders that did little more than flavour ice wine with the taste of dust. The placebo effect was the only medicine at work, sustained by the belief that the strength of animals could be transferred to humans through ingestion. Contraception carried its own grotesque medical rituals. Some healers recommended inserting cloth soaked in vinegar, garlic, or other caustic substances, claiming it would block conception. The result was burns, infections, and long-term damage. Others sold concoctions of herbal teas meant to induce miscarriage, brewed from plants that were toxic in high doses. Women risked their lives drinking these potions, balancing on the edge between unwanted pregnancy and poisoning. Without reliable science, every cup of bitter liquid was a gamble. Sexually transmitted diseases forced people into even stranger treatments. In addition to mercury, some healers prescribed moxibustion, the burning of herbs directly on the skin. Patients were told that applying burning mugwort to the groin would drive out disease. The reality was searing wounds layered on top of infection. The smell of singed flesh, mixed with the acrid smoke of burning herbs, turned the treatment room into a chamber of torture disguised as medicine. Yet sufferers endured it, convinced that pain equaled cure. Bathing was sometimes recommended as a treatment too, but with a twist. Hot springs or onsen were believed to purify the body. Men and women suffering from ailments soaked in sulphurous pools, hoping the minerals would restore their health. While some minerals may have offered mild relief, the communal nature of the baths turned them into perfect breeding grounds for spreading disease. Imagine soaking in steaming water with dozens of strangers, all carrying infections while believing you were being healed. It was a ritual of hope that often spread the very problems it sought to cure. The sensory experience of these remedies was brutal. Picture a small wooden room filled with the smoke of burning herbs, the sting of vinegar-soaked cloth, and the bitter taste of boiled roots. Patients coughed, winced, and endured, all while healers chanted reassurances and scribbled notes. The body was prodded, burned, rubbed with mercury ointments, or filled with concoctions that smelled like rotting plants. It was medicine as endurance test, survival through suffering. The economic burden was immense. Wealthy men spent fortunes importing exotic ingredients. Commoners pawned possessions to buy powders and teas that rarely worked. The floating world profited heavily from this desperation, with brothels selling remedies alongside companionship, turning disease into another commodity. Some courtesans even offered their own herbal brews, passed down through rumour and experience rather than medical knowledge. These were consumed with equal parts hope and fear, another layer of risk piled onto an already dangerous profession. Philosophical justifications framed these treatments as restoring balance. Disease was seen as imbalance between hot and cold, wet and dry, yin and yang. Remedies were designed to shock the body back into alignment. If it hurt, burned, or made you vomit, it was seen as proof that balance was being restored. The suffering became part of the cure, reinforcing the cycle. Modern science would recognise none of it, but for those trapped in the system, it was the only logic available. Imagine the absurdity in full. A man suffering from syphilis drinks mercury-laced tea while sitting in a sulphur bath, his groin covered in burning herbs, his hope tied to powders ground from antlers and bones. Around him, healers chant about balance, while the smell of vinegar and garlic fills the air. His body is poisoned, burned, and blistered, yet he believes himself on the path to recovery. The entire scene is both tragic and grotesque, a reflection of how far desperation can drive human invention. These practices remind us how sexuality in feudal Japan was bound not only to ritual and taboo, but also to medicine twisted by myth. Desire, disease, and fear created a marketplace where remedies were as dangerous as the problems they claimed to solve. It was a society where suffering was mistaken for healing, and where the pursuit of virility left countless bodies scarred or poisoned. And as the steam of the sulphur bath clings to your skin, another corner of this world opens. It is not medicine now, but art, where the grotesque was illustrated, printed, and sold openly. Erotic prints known as shunga carried both humour and horror, turning the private into spectacle and feeding imaginations with scenes that made even the strangest remedies look tame. The steam of the sulphur bath fades, and in its place comes the scratch of a brush across paper and the thud of wood blocks being pressed onto damp sheets. Medicine was not the only place where sexuality left its grotesque mark in feudal Japan. Art carried it too, transforming private acts into public commodities. Shunga, the erotic prints of the Edo period, reveal a world where intimacy was drawn, copied, and sold with astonishing openness. Yet the way it was portrayed often leaned into absurdity that makes modern eyes widen. Shunga literally means spring pictures, a euphemism for erotic art. These prints were created by some of the most famous artists of the time, including masters like Hokusai, who also produced serene landscapes of Mount Fuji. That the same hands that carved iconic waves also drew exaggerated scenes of entangled bodies says much about how normalized shunga was. Far from being hidden in back alleys, shunga was mainstream, sold by the thousands, owned by samurai, merchants, and even women. It was often given as a wedding gift, intended as both humour and instruction for the new couple. Imagine receiving a set of prints showing impossibly oversized anatomy as part of your marriage ceremony. It was awkward education wrapped in art. The exaggeration is what shocks most modern viewers. Anatomy in shunga was not realistic. It was grotesquely enlarged, sometimes depicted as comically huge in ways that defied physics. Men and women were shown with organs so large that they occupied half the page, leaving little room for the rest of their bodies. Scholars debate whether this was meant as humour, erotic fantasy, or symbolic exaggeration, but the effect was unmistakable. The result is a body of work that straddles the line between eroticism and parody. To viewers then, it may have been titillating. To viewers now, it looks absurd, like anatomy lessons drawn by pranksters. Yet shunga was not only about size, it was about variety. Scenes depicted courtesans, samurai, peasants, monks, and even supernatural beings entangled in acts that range from the sensual to the grotesque. Ghosts, animals, and mythical creatures sometimes appeared, blending folklore with sexuality. One of the most infamous prints, attributed to Hokusai, shows a woman embraced by octopuses, a surreal vision that mixes desire with the uncanny. Known as the Dream of the Fisherman's Wife, it is both art and nightmare, evidence of how far imagination could stretch when translating intimacy into ink. The humour of shunga was intentional. Many prints included dialogue balloons with bawdy jokes, puns, or satirical commentary. Lovers teased each other in text as much as in imagery, and sometimes the captions mocked the absurdity of the acts themselves. This made shunga more than pornography. It was entertainment, closer to comedy than instruction. For the merchant leafing through prints by lamplight, laughter mixed with desire, producing a form of escapism that poked fun at social rules while exploiting them. Hygiene and disease were not ignored. Some prints depicted sores or deformities, reminders of syphilis and other ailments. Others exaggerated smells, showing lines of odour wafting from bodies or making jokes about bad breath. These images remind us that shunga did not exist in a sanitized fantasy. It reflected the realities of Edo life, where poor hygiene and disease were constant companions. To modern audiences, the inclusion of sores and smells in erotic art seems bizarre, but to Edo viewers it was another layer of satire. Ownership of shunga was widespread, despite repeated bans by authorities. The Tokugawa shogunate issued edicts against their production, framing them as immoral, yet enforcement was half-hearted. Officials themselves owned prints, and the market thrived underground. In practice, the bans only made shunga more desirable. They were smuggled, hidden in bundles of books and sold discreetly, their popularity undiminished. It was a cat-and-mouse game between censors and artists, with art winning every round. The sensory impact of these prints must have been intense. Imagine sliding one from a wooden box by candlelight, the paper still faintly smelling of ink and oil, the colours vivid against the dim room. The exaggerated forms leap from the page, grotesque and comic all at once. In a culture that emphasised modesty in public, these prints offered an outlet of excess. They transformed the private into spectacle, turning intimacy into something that could be bought, traded and displayed like any other commodity. Women were not excluded from this market. Records suggest many wives owned shunga, sometimes keeping them hidden in boxes, sometimes sharing them openly with friends. For them, the prints provided both amusement and a way to navigate expectations. With marriages arranged for duty rather than passion, shunga offered a window into the absurdity of intimacy. Some women even annotated their prints with personal notes, creating collections that blended art with diary. It was, in its way, an early form of candid commentary on the contradictions of sexual life. The absurdity becomes sharper when we consider how shunga influenced education. In some cases, couples were expected to study the prints before marriage, treating them as instructional guides. Imagine preparing for your wedding night by studying drawings of impossibly large anatomy, paired with puns about bad breath. It was an awkward attempt at sex education, one that substituted comedy for clarity. Yet it shows how seriously art was intertwined with intimacy. Shunga also served a social critique. Some prints mocked monks, showing them entangled with acolytes, highlighting temple scandals in graphic detail. Others lampooned samurai, depicting them in compromising positions that undermined their image of stoic discipline. By turning authority figures into objects of erotic humour, shunga punctured the rigidity of Edo society. It was pornography, but it was also political satire, one that used grotesque exaggeration to expose hypocrisy. Picture the scene of its consumption. A merchant sits in his narrow townhouse, lantern burning low, a cup of sake by his side. He flips through prints of courtesans and samurai, laughing at their absurd proportions, aroused and amused in equal measure. Outside, the city hums with the noise of festivals and trade, but inside, art has created a private theatre of grotesque fantasy. The smell of ink lingers, the texture of the paper rough beneath his fingers. This is intimacy transformed into commodity, both serious and ridiculous. Shungo reveals the contradictions at the core of feudal Japan's sexual practices. It was simultaneously erotic and comedic, grotesque and beautiful, forbidden and widespread. It turned human bodies into exaggerated symbols, reminding viewers that sexuality was as much about imagination as reality. And in doing so, it preserved a record of how deeply entangled desire, humour and taboo were in the culture of the floating world. As the candlelight fades over these absurd prints, another layer of the story begins to emerge. It is not only about what was drawn on paper, but about what was performed in flesh. Behind the curtains of brothels and on the mats of common homes, rituals of voyeurism and performance created their own disturbing customs, where sexuality became theatre and privacy was nowhere to be found. The candlelight over the Shunga prints fades, but the obsession with watching does not vanish. In feudal Japan, intimacy was never confined to private spaces. It spilled into performance, into ritualized voyeurism, and into customs that turned bedrooms into stages and audiences into participants. Sexuality became theatre, performed and observed, often with little regard for the privacy of those involved. Public baths provided one of the earliest stages. Onsen and sento were central to Japanese life, places where men and women bathed, gossiped and negotiated social ties. In earlier centuries, mixed bathing was common, with men and women sharing the same pools. While it was defended as natural and communal, it also became a site of voyeurism. Travellers wrote about men lingering too long, women averting their eyes, and attendants pretending not to notice the curious stares. The steamy air, heavy with sulphur, turned every movement into a silhouette, every splash into a distraction. Privacy was dissolved in the hot water, leaving bodies exposed to eyes that feigned indifference. Voyeurism stretched beyond baths. In the floating world of Edo, brothels and tea-houses often blurred the line between public performance and private act. Courtesans were displayed in cages along the streets of Yoshiwara, their faces painted and bodies framed like merchandise in a shop window. Men strolled past, judging beauty and status, gawking at women who were forced to smile while enduring the humiliation of being treated as living displays. The spectacle was deliberate. It drew crowds, heightened desire, and transformed intimacy into a market of observation before it was ever a matter of touch. Peep shows emerged in smaller quarters. Some establishments offered hidden screens or tiny rooms where men could watch others in acts of intimacy, a practice that blurred into both entertainment and ritual. These were often justified as educational, teaching clients what awaited them, but the reality was titillation. Imagine peering through a wooden slat at the shadowy forms of courtesans and clients, the smell of sake heavy in the air while others waited their turn. It was intimacy commodified twice, once for the participants and again for the audience. Kabuki theatre added another layer. Though not explicitly sexual, it often carried erotic undertones. Male actors playing women, known as onagata, became objects of both admiration and desire. Their stylized movements, painted faces, and fluid gestures blurred gender roles and fascinated audiences. Some actors maintained relationships with wealthy patrons, and their performances were not limited to the stage. Voyeurism extended into backstage arrangements, where the boundary between art and intimacy dissolved. Kabuki became a theatre of seduction as much as drama. a spectacle where watching carried layered meanings. Even within households, voyeurism crept in. Sliding paper walls and thin partitions meant privacy was nearly impossible. Families lived in cramped spaces where sounds carried easily, and neighbours heard more than they wished. Intimacy could not be concealed, and in some cases, it was not even expected to be. Servants, attendants, and relatives often shared spaces, their presence turning private act into half-public events. The architecture of Japanese homes, beautiful in its simplicity, created a constant backdrop of observation. Ritualized voyeurism also took religious forms. Some fertility festivals included public displays of intimacy, symbolic acts carried out under the gaze of the community. Couples might lie together in fields or enact rituals before shrines, watched by villagers who believed that their participation secured abundance for all. It was theatre framed as devotion, and while the participants may have been reluctant, the weight of tradition left a little room to refuse. To modern sensibilities it seems invasive. To them, it was duty. The sensory world of these practices is easy to imagine. A crowded bathhouse filled with steam, the sound of water slapping against wood, and eyes darting through the mist. The streets of Yoshiwara lined with lanterns, courtesans framed in windows like dolls, their painted faces hiding exhaustion. A small room reeking of spilled sake, where men crouched behind a screen to spy on acts they paid only to observe. The faint rustle of kimono in a family home where paper walls cannot block the size of intimacy. Each moment is thick with exposure, where watching is as important as doing. The humour lies in the contradictions. A culture that prized modesty and ritualised politeness openly embraced forms of voyeurism that left little to the imagination. Men who bowed with rigid etiquette in public flocked to brothel windows to ogle women displayed like ornaments. Communities that shunned women as polluted during childbirth gathered to watch fertility rituals. Actors who played women on stage became lovers of men who would never admit attraction outside the theatre. Privacy was valued in theory, but undermined at every turn by architecture, ritual, and spectacle. This voyeuristic culture left lasting marks. Shunga prints depicted scenes of spying, turning it into another subject of satire. Writers composed stories about men caught peeping, mocking their hypocrisy. Even legal codes occasionally referenced peeping as a problem, though punishments were often light. The practice was too embedded in daily life to be stamped out. It was tolerated, laughed at, and woven into entertainment. Watching was normalised, even when it crossed into the grotesque. Picture the absurdity in full. A bathhouse filled with bodies glistening in steam, a row of courtesans framed like living dolls, men crouched behind screens whispering jokes as they spy, a family pressed together in a one-room house where every sigh carries through thin walls. Sexuality was not hidden in feudal Japan. It was paraded, performed, and observed, turned into theatre for audiences both willing and unwilling. The culture made intimacy something to watch, a public act disguised as private ritual. You've survived another round of historical misery, though let's be honest, you're probably rethinking that futon purchase by now. If you enjoyed drifting off to the sounds of centuries-old suffering, go ahead and let me know in the comments which topic you'd like me to ruin for you next. I'm always curious what kind of nightmare fuel you want me to dig up from history, and if this sort of thing helps you relax, make sure to check out my other videos. Nothing says sweet dreams quite like lice, rituals, and a healthy dose of human discomfort.